The wind has stopped. That is the first thing you notice. Standing on the eastern shore of Palmyra Atoll, 1,200 miles south of Hawaii, in the precise geographic middle of nowhere, the wind has simply stopped. The lagoon is a mirror. The sky presses down in 40 shades of blue, and the trees, and there are so many trees now, tangled and enormous and dripping with life, the trees are perfectly, unnervingly still. Something moves in the canopy above you. A frigate bird, black as obsidian, with a wingspan wider than a man, is tall, shifts its weight on a branch, and watches you with one prehistoric eye. It does not flee. It has no reason to. You are the strange thing here. You are the visitor. This island, this wild, improbable, reclaimed island, belongs entirely to something else now. But it wasn't always like this. 30 years ago, this atoll was a different kind of place. The coconut palms stood in rigid, unnatural rows, planted by human hands in the early 20th century for a copra industry that never quite succeeded. The soil beneath them was compacted, poisoned with decades of runoff, stripped of its original understory. Rats moved through the roots in the tens of thousands. The native seabirds, those ancient navigators who had used this island as a waypoint for millions of years, had been largely pushed aside. The reef, once among the most pristine in the Pacific, was stressed and bleaching at its edges. This place had been altered, managed, controlled, shaped to serve human ambition, and it was quietly dying underneath all of that management. And then a billionaire arrived with a blueprint. His name was Harmon Hall, a technology entrepreneur from San Francisco who had made his fortune in the early internet boom of the 1990s and spent the following decade searching for what he described in interviews as the last untouched places. In 1998, he entered into a lease agreement with the United States Fish and Wildlife Service to develop a portion of Palmyra Atoll into an exclusive eco-resort, not a destructive resort, not a bulldozed resort. He was careful to say that. He had architects design structures that floated above the ground on stilts. He had engineers design a private airstrip expansion. He had biologists on the payroll. He called it sustainable luxury. He called it visionary. The project stalled almost immediately. Permits were delayed. Funding dried up in the dot-com bust of 2001. Harmon Hall lost most of his fortune, and then, as tends to happen when the money goes, he quietly disappeared from the story. The half-built structures were never completed. The generators, shipped at enormous expense, were never fully installed. The workers left. The construction equipment was abandoned where it stood, and Palmyra Atoll was returned, by default, by economic failure, by the simple indifference of a world that had moved on to itself. What happened next is one of the most extraordinary ecological stories of our time. Think for a moment about what a forest remembers, not in any mystical sense, but in a deeply biological one. Beneath the soil of a degraded ecosystem, even one that has been suppressed for decades, there exists something ecologists call the seed bank, a library of dormancy. Native species that have not grown above ground in 50 years can persist as seeds, as root fragments, as spores, waiting with a patience that makes human ambition feel very small indeed. When the pressure is removed, when the rats are controlled, when the coconut monoculture begins to fragment, when the soil is allowed to breathe, these ancient inhabitants begin, slowly and then with tremendous speed, to return. The Nature Conservancy acquired Palmyra Atoll in 2000, and when the resort project collapsed, they began one of the most ambitious ecological restoration efforts ever attempted on a Pacific island. The centerpiece of that effort was rodent eradication. This is not a gentle process. It is not comfortable to describe, but it is necessary to understand. Rats, specifically the black rat, Rattus rattus, which arrived on Pacific islands aboard sailing ships in the 18th and 19th centuries, are among the most destructive invasive species on Earth. On seabird islands, they are catastrophic. They eat eggs, they eat chicks, they gnaw through the shells of nesting albatrosses in the dark. A single breeding pair of rats can become 40,000 individuals in a single year under ideal conditions. On Palmyra, the rat population numbered in the hundreds of thousands. In 2011, after years of planning and scientific debate, the Nature Conservancy and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service dropped poison bait from helicopters across the entire atoll. Every island, every spit of land, every palm-covered hummock, they waited, and then they waited some more, and when it was over, and the monitoring teams moved through the undergrowth for weeks and found nothing, no signs, no tracks, no droppings. They declared Palmyra rat-free for the first time in over 2 centuries. What followed was not gradual. That is the part that still astonishes the scientists who have been measuring it. Within 18 months, the seabird colonies exploded. Red-footed boobies, which had been nesting on Palmyra in declining numbers for decades, suddenly doubled their population, then doubled it again. The masked booby returned. The white tern, that impossibly delicate creature that lays its single egg on a bare branch with a faith imbalance that seems almost philosophical, began appearing in numbers that researchers described in their careful scientific language as statistically remarkable. Brown noddies packed the newly growing native trees so densely that the branches bent under their weight. And the trees. Here is where the story becomes almost mythological. The native tree species of Palmyra, Pisonia grandis chief among them, had been so suppressed by the coconut monoculture that they existed only as scattered, struggling individuals across the atoll. Pisonia is a remarkable organism. It grows to enormous size. Its bark is pale and smooth, almost luminous in certain lights, like something sculpted from sea foam. Its seeds are covered in a sticky, viscous coating that adheres to seabird feathers. This is how the tree disperses across ocean islands, riding on the bodies of birds in a partnership millions of years in the making. Without seabirds, there is no Pisonia forest, and without Pisonia forest, there are fewer seabirds. The relationship is one of those elegant, co-evolved locks for which life keeps producing perfectly fitted keys. With the rats gone and the seabird colonies surging, Pisonia seeds began arriving on Palmyra in unprecedented quantities. The seedlings emerged from the soil in their hundreds, then their thousands. The scientists monitoring the island began documenting something they had never seen at this pace. Forest succession accelerating at a rate that their models had predicted would take a century, happening instead in a decade. But the transformation did not stop at the tree line. Seabirds are what ecologists call a keystone species, not because of their size or their ferocity, but because of what they carry with them. Guano, the nitrogen-rich waste of millions of seabirds falling into the soil of a small island, creates what researchers have described as a nutrient pulse of extraordinary intensity. The soils of seabird islands are chemically distinct from those of islands without colonies. They are richer, deeper, more biologically active, and this richness does not stay on land, it flows. As rain washes guano into the lagoon and the surrounding reef, it carries with it a cascade of nutrients that fertilizes the entire marine ecosystem. Studies conducted at Palmyra over the past 15 years have documented a correlation so striking it initially seemed impossible. Islands with large seabird colonies have reefs with dramatically higher fish biomass than nearby islands without them. The fish are larger. The predatory species, sharks, jacks, giant trevally, are more abundant. The reef ecosystem, fed from above by birds nesting in trees grown from seeds carried by those same birds, functions at a metabolic intensity that reefs near human settlements can barely approximate. This is what we mean when we speak of interconnection, not as a pleasant idea, as a physical reality, as measurable chemistry. And then there is the question that sits at the center of all of this, the question that the abandoned construction equipment, still sitting in the undergrowth, slowly being consumed by vegetation and rust, seems to ask in silence every single day. What did we think we were managing? When Harmon Hall arrived with his architects and his permits and his vision of sustainable luxury, he was operating from an assumption so deeply embedded in Western thinking that it rarely gets examined. The assumption that nature is a backdrop, that it is a setting, that it exists in a state of passive readiness, waiting to be arranged, developed, improved, monetized, experienced. The eco-resort framing was, in its way, more revealing than a conventional resort would have been. At least a conventional resort makes no pretense of partnership. The eco-resort claimed to be in dialogue with the natural world, while ultimately asserting the same fundamental position that human intelligence, human design, human intention is what gives a place its highest value. Palmyra answered that assumption with 40 years of compounding life. The native Hawaiians who occasionally navigated to this atoll over centuries left almost no trace. The guano miners of the late 19th century, who stripped the islands of their accumulated fertilizer and shipped it to American farms, left scars that took decades to heal. The United States Navy, which built a base on Palmyra during the Second World War and dredged the lagoon to create an anchorage for flying boats, left deep physical alterations that are still visible beneath the water today. Harmon Hall left a generator shed and a rusting excavator and a pier that the mangroves are slowly disassembling. Each wave of human ambition retreated, and each time the island did not simply recover, it remembered. This is perhaps the most humbling scientific insight that ecological restoration science has produced in the past 3 decades, that ecosystems do not need to be rebuilt from scratch, they need to be unlocked. The biological potential of a place is not destroyed by decades of disturbance. It is suppressed. It is waiting. Remove the pressure. Remove the rats. Step back. Give it time, and the living system will do what living systems have been doing for 4 billion years. Find the path toward complexity, toward diversity, toward the breathtaking, recursive, self-reinforcing architecture of ecological health. The seabirds return, the seeds arrive, the forest grows, the guano falls, the reef thrives, the fish return, the sharks follow, the coral spawns, the currents carry larvae to new reefs. Everything is downstream of everything else. Everything is upstream of everything else. The boundary between cause and effect dissolves into something that looks less like a chain and more like a conversation. There is a pod of spinner dolphins that moves through Palmyra's lagoon on certain mornings. Researchers have been studying them for years, and what they have found is that the dolphins spend part of their nights in the open ocean, feeding in the deep water columns, and then return to the atoll in the hours around dawn to rest in the shallow, sheltered, warm water of the inner lagoon. They come to the island as the seabirds do, as the fish do, as the turtles do, because this place offers something irreplaceable: safety, abundance, the specific chemistry of a healthy reef, the particular quality of shelter that an island provides against the infinite indifference of open ocean. They did not know about the Billionaire's resort plans. They did not know about the .com bust. They did not track the fate of the permits or the architectural renderings or the investor presentations. They simply came back, as they always had, because the island was still here. Standing on that eastern shore now, watching the frigate bird rebalance itself on its branch, you begin to feel something shift in how you are thinking about this place. The story you arrived with, the story of a billionaire's failed ambition, of nature's resilience, of ecological restoration, begins to feel like it is missing something, because the framing of nature taking back still positions nature as reactive, as responsive, as a force that exists in relation to human decisions. But Palmyra was here 12 million years before the first human walked the earth. The Pisonia trees and the frigate birds and the spinner dolphins and the white-tipped reef sharks moving through the channels in the pale blue dusk. They are not reclaiming anything. They are not responding to Harmon Hall or the Nature Conservancy or the United States Fish and Wildlife Service. They are simply continuing a conversation that began before our species learned to speak. We interrupted it for a moment, a geological eye blink, a century and a half of rats and copra and guano and generators. And now that interruption has ended and the conversation has resumed. We like to call this recovery. We like to call this rewilding. We give it names that place us at the center of the story, as the agents of rescue, as the architects of return. But perhaps the more accurate thing to say is simply this: we got out of the way, and look what was waiting. The frigate bird opens its wings, those vast dark wings, and lifts itself into the still air above the Pisonia canopy without apparent effort, riding a thermal you cannot feel from the ground. It rises until it is a small black cross against the deep equatorial blue. It turns once, lazily, surveying the atoll below, the lagoon and the reef and the crowded nesting trees and the rusting generator shed slowly disappearing into green, and then it tilts its wings and slides away to the south, toward the open ocean, toward the horizon, toward whatever it is that frigate birds are always moving toward. You watch it go, and in the silence that follows, in the absolute ringing, living silence of an island healing itself at the edge of the world, you find yourself wondering about all the other places, all the other interrupted conversations, all the other seed banks sleeping in suppressed soil, waiting for the pressure to lift, waiting for us to remember or perhaps to forget just long enough that we are not the authors of this world. We are at our best its most careful listeners.